Welcome, friends, to our fall series of Ventures courses. We're starting out with a two-part course this Monday and next Monday that will be led by Dave Eckert. And there are a few other courses that we have lined up for this fall already. You'll want to make sure, if you haven't, to check those offerings out. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave and then turn things over to him so that we can start our course for this evening. So I met Dave a few years ago, kind of virtually during the pandemic, as he did a workshop for us in Ambler. Dave is the founder and director of Intersect. It's an initiative within Access Services that supports those at the intersection of faith and mental health through consultations and training and fostering of collaboration between faith communities and mental health providers. So we thought it would be a perfect fit for Ventures. Dave spent over 20 years working for Access within various roles, including the director of a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation program and also the agency chaplain. Dave is also an ordained minister, serving as one of the pastors at Grace Community Church in Chalfont, Pennsylvania, for the last 15 years. Dave is a certified trainer in areas of suicide prevention or suicide intervention, and psychiatric rehabilitation. Is also co-author of the Opioid Response Network's Opioid Use Disorder Toolkit for Faith-Based Community Leaders. Dave holds degrees in social work, biblical studies, and divinity, and he and his wife and 3 children live in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which is where I also happen to pastor and where we intersected, if I can use that pun. And so, Dave, we were just delighted that you were willing to come and lead a course for us here, for all of us gathered from across the country. And so I just would like to turn it over to you and let you take us through the next 2 weeks of work that will sort of dovetail with each other. But as we said, you don't have to have seen this first session to attend the second session. So if what you all see you're finding value in, tell your friends, get them to come back. Let's see if we can double how many people we have, for next week. So Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Ensign, for having me, and thank you all for spending your Monday night with me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we're going to be walking through a PowerPoint together. Okay, I'm gonna walk up the screen here. Okay. So yes, tonight the session that we're going to be looking at together is just broadly supporting people with mental health struggles in your congregation and community. Just making sure the clicker here works. Okay. So as was mentioned, I direct an initiative called Intersect, and I won't go into this too much, but just to say how this training fits into what I've been seeing over my several years in both the mental health field and working in pastoral ministry. What happened was, because of having a foot in each of these worlds over all these years, I began to learn a couple things through that process. One was that many of our faith communities and churches often struggle to know how to walk with people experiencing mental illness, while at the same time, many of our providers, our mental health service organizations, struggle to know how to pay attention to the spiritual dimension of people. And so sometimes I'm talking to mental health providers, trying to help them connect with churches, and then other times, like tonight, I'm speaking more with people from churches, trying to support them in how they can best walk with people experiencing mental illness, both in their congregations, but also in the broader community. And so as we begin to get into this, I just want to make sure we've defined our terms. This is not the most interesting part of the night, but it is making sure you know what I mean when I'm using some of these different terms. Mental illness, I'm not talking about intellectual disabilities, what used to be referred to as a mental retardation or mental disabilities. I'm speaking about mental illness as in these sorts of disorders around thinking, emotion, or behavior that have to do with compromised function in how we do life. I am not, if you hear me talk about serious mental illness, I'm referring to the same thing, but serious mental illness typically has to do with things like schizophrenia or depression or anxiety or bipolar. You may hear me use the term mental health or mental health struggle, which similarly is just trying to get at more of the positive aspect of all this. What contributes to our mental health? What contributes to effective functioning in these areas of productive activities like work or healthy relationships or coping with adversity? I'm not focusing on any one of these areas, but I may use any of these terms to get at the experience of certain people that you may know in your families, in your churches, that you may know in your community who are experiencing mental illness or a mental health struggle. I want to say what this talk isn't and then what it is. Again, just trying to give you some clarity before we jump into things. I can't give a cure. You probably know that. There's nothing I'm going to say that's just going to make things easy. It's not going to be a nice little formula. If you just do these exact steps, then everything will be easy for the person you're helping or for yourself as the helper. And I'm not focusing on one type of relationship. In other words, this may apply or this will apply if you're clergy with someone in your congregation. It'll apply if you're a ministry leader. It'll apply if you're talking about a peer in your congregation or someone you know in the community or a family member. I'm not focusing on any one of those relationships. So if that's not what this talk is, what is it? Well, one way of putting it is these are approaches and tools for supporting people over time, right? Not a formula, but over time in a way that maintains your health and provides opportunities for change. So we're going to spend some time looking at what can you do that's helpful to others, but also as you're doing that, what do you need to be doing to make sure you can be in this for the long haul? So we're going to spend all of our time basically looking at 5 approaches to help, regardless of diagnosis, regardless of the exact relationship you have. 5 approaches to help. Help that is open, relational, holistic, sustainable, and resourceful. And after we get through each one, we're going to have a bit of time for discussion. We're going to have breakouts where you're going to be able to discuss together what it looks like to be that kind of helper, to practice this sort of approach. And halfway through, we're going to take a little bit of a break. So that's what our night is going to look like together. First, we want to provide help that is open. There is a need when it comes to helping people around their mental health for open dialogue. If I didn't know it already, it would become clear to me when I had decided in my own church to preach on this topic. I thought, I'm working in the field in this area. I should really be addressing this as a pastor with the congregation. So I preached from Matthew chapter 9 on the topic of how the church can support people around their mental health. Well, after the sermon, one of the leaders in our church came up to me and he said, "Dave, I'm taking my daughter to a psychiatrist tomorrow, and I didn't know I could talk about that here until today." So this was someone who was a leader in our church. Everyone knew him. Everyone knew his daughter. But something about the air we breathed in our church, just the way we did life together, made him think, you shouldn't bring this up. You can bring up other struggles, but don't bring up your family's mental health struggles. And it enforced the notion that we had to create pathways for open dialogue within our church. Another reason this is so important is something a local pastor told me just recently. We were having lunch, and he said, I really don't know much about this topic. I don't really address this issue much as a church. And what he says is it can be easy to ignore issues we don't understand. So from his vantage point, he simply didn't understand this issue, and so he never brought it up. And so what we're hoping for tonight and next week is that we would increase understanding so that you'd have the confidence to bring up these issues and to encourage others to bring it up. And that even if you felt like, man, there's still more I want to know, that you would be okay with bringing it up anyway because you recognize people in the congregations and the communities where you serve need someone to bring it up because they may not bring it up on their own. I want to talk about now a few ways of how we might bring this topic up. And one thing to think about when bringing it up publicly, before the whole congregation, is to, as author Ann Voskamp put it, give the gift of going second. You may have heard of this before. What does that mean? It means that when you go first, when you share a struggle that you're experiencing, you are giving others a gift. It's the gift of going second. They now don't have to be the first one to become vulnerable because someone else already has. So this may be yourself, this may be another person in your congregation, that if they can take that step of opening up first, telling their story to the church, then you might find that other people start coming along as well. It's sort of a Me Too movement sort of approach that says, oh, you're experiencing that? Me too. In my own church, when certain people have given their testimony and included their experience of living with mental illness, I've seen others come out of the woodwork in my church, people I didn't even know had these experiences, but because someone else had the courage to go first, they then joined along and started sharing. Now, where might you do this? What are some venues or spaces where you might try to open up dialogue publicly? Here's just a few ideas. One is having a mental health Sunday. There's a church in our area that does this. Once a year is a mental health Sunday, typically during Mental Health Awareness Month, where there will be a sermon on the topic, and there will be people who tell their stories. I have at the bottom of the list, tell their testimonies. And it's a way for the congregation to know it's coming and for people to together be able to give attention to this. It could be in your weekly public prayer. Oftentimes there's pastoral prayers, or there are just other spaces, maybe in small groups, where you are praying for the needs of people in your church. And we often think to pray for people's physical health, but we could also be praying for the mental health needs within our congregation or community. Maybe even specifically if there are people who've given you permission to do so. I've mentioned already preaching. I've been asked by several churches to come and just preach on a Sunday morning where I open up the text. I've often done it in Matthew 9, where you see Jesus holistically serving people. And even if it doesn't use specifically language about mental illness, and there are texts in Scripture that do that you could preach a sermon from, it's still a way of expressing to the church that this issue matters, and it opens up dialogue. Or teaching and workshops like the one we're doing tonight, and taking that to your church. And as I've already said, testimonies, places where people can tell their own stories. Now, what about personally? How do you open up dialogue personally? It's one thing to do it publicly with the congregation. How do you do it one-on-one? Well, one idea, an axiom to keep in mind, is to give the gift of presence and not just the gift of advice. Sometimes we learn from someone else that an individual has a mental illness. That's part of their journey. Sometimes people tell us themselves, and we have this knee-jerk response to give advice, to tell them what they have to do. You need to start your medication. You need to go see a psychiatrist. You need to do this. Or, oh, you're facing this because this occurred. One example of what this looks like, to give the gift of presence and not just the gift of advice, is in Job. You may remember in the book of Job, Job begins suffering for reasons that no one understands, neither Job nor his friends. And it says that his friends then sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. They just were present with him and silent. Now, if you've read the book of Job, you'll know that this is the best thing these friends do. Because after this happens, they begin getting what you might call causality cravings. They want to know what is the cause of why Job is experiencing this suffering. And instead of just giving him the gift of presence, they start giving what they think is the gift of their advice. And you see in Job 8 here, his friend Bildad says, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. He starts saying, you're going through this experience because of sin. Now, I'm not saying sin isn't a real issue, and I'm not saying that people with mental illness don't sin, but I am saying that I've led spirituality groups at Access of people who've walked away from the church because the church made them feel like their mental illness, their mental health struggle was all related to their own doing. And instead of taking a holistic response that we'll talk about later, that takes decisions and sin seriously, but also takes seriously the predispositions towards certain types of mental health struggles. Some of these folks just got pushed away, and now they were in this spirituality group wanting church community, wanting to reconnect with God, but wondering how to best do it. Well, after Job's friends got through many chapters of giving advice, we then are able to hear from God on the whole thing. And it says, after the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. In other words, all your advice was wrong. You think you understood this person's story and why they were suffering the way they did, but you weren't as smart as you think you were. And so it takes time to be present with people who are experiencing a mental health struggle for us to find out why it's happening and what would be helpful to them. Now, as you're doing this, as you're having these conversations, one more thing I think is really important when you're opening up dialogue is to, as a colleague of mine says, speak human. Sometimes we can talk more like psychiatrists than humans when we're trying to walk alongside people. And it causes some with mental illness to kind of push help away because they don't like the language that's being used about their experience. So a few ways to speak human: instead of speaking about a mental disorder, you might just want to speak about a mental health struggle. Instead of calling someone who's hearing voices a schizophrenic, you might just refer to them, whatever their name is, Bob, Sally, as someone who hears voices. Someone who's experienced a breakdown, nervous breakdown. Maybe you might want to say, oh, it's a bad day. I heard you had a bad day that you went through. Tell me more about that. I know one person who experiences severe depression referred to that experience for them as times of their fog, a fog they go into. The idea here isn't to be comprehensive in the language and to tell you all the things you might say, but to instead sit with the person enough and learn from the person how they like to describe what their experience is like and use the language they use for themselves as a way of connecting with them and of opening up dialogue. Because if we don't open up dialogue, there's going to be no way in which a person will be actually open to receiving help. Now we come to this first part where we're going to spend a little bit of time in discussion. And so there's going to be a breakout. And during your breakout, I want you to discuss these two questions. Okay? And it's only going to be about 4 minutes or so of a breakout time. Then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more ourselves. First question: what are the challenges of talking about mental illness publicly or openly within your context? What makes that hard in your congregation, in your space? Bring it up and talking about it publicly. Second question: what are specific opportunities or spaces where you can open up dialogue in your context? What are opportunities? So what makes it hard? And then what are opportunities for doing it? Enton has put in the chat these two questions for you to be able to walk through. And Enton, is there anything else people need to know before you send them on their way to their breakouts?
Dave, how long shall people think they're going to be in the breakout room so they sort of know how to plan?
Why don't we say 4 minutes and we'll see how that goes, just so we can keep moving through the training. Then we'll come back and talk and we can readjust if it's more helpful to the group.
Okay, so that will take us to about 26 after the hour. Does anyone have any questions about the breakout groups? I'll note that there will not be any recording of breakout groups, so you can feel free to be completely open if you wish. In those, we're recording the main session, but breakout groups won't be recorded. Steve, I see you've got a question. Just unmute first, Steve, so we can hear you.
This is for Kendra. I have been frantically emailing you because I didn't have a link. It went to spam, and I'm now in the meeting.
Okay, glad you're here, Steve. Saw you come in. So, and any other questions before we jump into breakout groups? Okay, we'll give you 4 minutes. I'll give you kind of a warning, but it means you'll have to be pretty focused on those 2 questions. So let's go ahead, and here we go. So, Dave, back to you.
So we're not going to be able to hear, obviously, from everyone, and maybe not all of you would like to share in this large group. But what I am going to ask for is if maybe a couple of you who would like to represent your group might share an insight, a theme of your conversation that could aid all of us in thinking through how to open up dialogue within our congregations, our spaces where we're ministering. So anyone like to go first? And give someone else the gift of going second.
I'll go first. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Steve, I see you're trying to talk, but you're muted. And I wasn't sure who else besides Don also volunteered. But Steve, if you would like to go first, do that, and then we'll call on Don. So just unmute, Steve. You're still muted.
Okay. My situation is I am chaplain at a peer-operated, it's a drop-in center for people with mental illness. So it's assumed, so everybody there, it's a ministry of the disabled for the disabled. And so instead of professionals, we are an additional support system, and it's assumed that everybody there, and myself, who I'm bipolar, everybody has a mental illness.
So that makes that has the potential, at least, to make conversation a little bit easier to enter into if that assumption's already in place. Would that be correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Don, would you like to share as well?
So I hope my group doesn't mind that I stepped up, and please feel free to step in and say anything you want. But essentially, and I don't usually do this either. So essentially what we were talking about, I was personally really struck by the Job text and the whole presence thing. And we talked a lot about that. You know, we don't have to immediately fix something, you know, and just really creating, you know, a welcoming, you know, I push very hard from the pulpit constantly about safe harbor. This is a safe place. This is your church home. You know, you can be accepted for who you are, how you are, where you are here. This maybe not any place else, but here you can. And just kind of, and I think if you can make people feel welcomed and accepted and not threatened, then I think that you can, you know, you have those chances for the dialogue and conversation. That's pretty much what we talked about. At least I did.
Really helpful, Don, in your group. What you're referring to, I have a colleague who refers to it as the writing reflex. Just this reflex, this instinct we have to immediately have to solve or make things right, instead of realizing that, ironically, slowing ourselves down isn't somehow not doing anything. It may be the very thing that person needs.
Right. We don't need to necessarily fix it. And people don't understand just how powerful just presence can be, just that and again, that just shows again that whole acceptance, understanding, safe harbor kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. Love that concept. Anyone else, like one more person, like to share an insight that they gleaned or a theme of their conversation as a group?
I think the mental health Sunday would be beneficial in our church to open in a broader way the sharing that we're already doing, and could bring some tools by that folks could use.
Yes, one of the things that the pastor that I know who does a mental health Sunday, he got into it because of his son's journey with mental illness. But he realized his congregation has now developed a reputation in the community through those mental health Sundays. And there will be people who will come and have gotten connected because of that congregation's reputation through some of that work. So it both ministers to people internally, but also in a way helps with the witness you're shaping for your broader community. So thanks for that insight, Joseph. Just to keep us moving forward, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to walk to the next approach that we're going to take in supporting people. Okay, so we talked about an approach of being opening dialogue. The second we're going to look at is being relational. One of the things I learned about the need for relational help, or I'll say one of the ways I learned about the need for relational help, was in my work directing a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation program for several years. And over again, we'd get to the end of working with people where we believed we'd offered a quality service, but we had nothing to discharge people to. And we had become their best friends. So people didn't want to be discharged, not because they needed more of our services, but because they had no community in which to be discharged to. And I realized that what we were offering was good, but even the best social service can't offer community to people. And that's where oftentimes the church would come in through Intersect when we were trying to help foster collaboration for the sake of people we were serving. Another moment in which I learned this lesson was when my own church was trying to reach out and provide support to people who were homeless by connecting to the local homeless shelter. So I spoke to the director of the shelter and said, what can we do? And we had our own ideas of what we could do. And she said, just come over on Friday, bring pizza, and be present. And I think she threw in, bring some board games. Her point was, these people have been given coats and they've been given soup. What they haven't been given is friends. And what your church can do is simply be a friend and come out and talk to them. And therefore, it shows you the amazing reality that by the church just being the church, just offering relationship, it can have a profound impact on people with mental health struggles who simply need relational help. This has been a concept that's getting a lot of traction when it comes to our youth. I don't know if any of you read the book iGen by Jean Twenge. I think I'm saying the name correctly. But this book is exploring the I generation, Generation Z. And I want to read a couple quotes she has. She writes, iGen is on the verge of the most severe mental health crisis for young people in decades. On the surface, though, everything is fine. So there's this increasing mental health crisis that she is talking about for our youth. One way she describes why this crisis may be taking the shape it is, she writes elsewhere, if an activity involves a screen, it's linked to less happiness and more depression. If it doesn't, particularly if it involves in-person social interaction or exercise, it's linked to more happiness and less depression. And in her book, she keeps emphasizing that you have, on the one hand, increasing levels of mental illness among the youth and decreasing levels of social connection. And they're happening at the same time. And it emphasizes the need simply for our youth to be in community, which becomes really hard in a digital age. And yet it teaches us a lesson that the church has a lot to offer when it comes to this. So how do we do it? How do we offer relational help? Well, I want to use a couple metaphors here to maybe get us thinking. One is a quote that a friend uses. He says, relationships are the vehicle for change, so get tune-ups. In other words, if change typically happens for any of us through some sort of relational help, through some relationship we're in, we rarely just do it all on our own. If that's true, then like with our vehicles, we need to get tune-ups. And so if there's people that you can think of in your life, maybe they're living with mental illness, and you think, you know what, I've reached out to them before, but we've kind of lost track, lost touch, because I'm super busy, got a lot going on. It may be worth thinking about those people and thinking, how can I get a tune-up in my relationship, reach back out to them? Or how do I create a rhythm where I can stay in touch with them over time? Now, to use an economic metaphor, too many metaphors, build relational capital and spend it too. Relational capital simply means earning the right, having the capital, earning the right to be able to speak into someone's life. Now, I say spend it too because we can fall into one of two camps. Some of us don't build relational capital. We just say it like it is and don't even build the relationship. And when we do that, we tend to end relationships when we just say it like it is without having built the relational capital. But other people, we would never do that. We are all about engaging and building relationships with people, but we have all this relational capital with which to maybe have some hard conversations with someone about some changes they can make, but we never spend it. So think about yourself and say, am I the type of person who's just needs to spend more time building relational capital, or am I the type of person that maybe needs to use that capital to ask some hard questions, offer some feedback to somebody? Third, explore peer support options. Peer support professionals, it's a significant thing in the mental health field right now. It's the idea of someone with a lived experience helping another person with a lived experience of mental illness, because as in many areas of life, when you've gone through something, you uniquely understand what another person has gone through and how to engage that person. So you might think about in your own congregation or context, who are people you could tap who have a lived experience and have made some progress in their recovery journey, who might be able to reach out to other people who've gone through something. And if you can be connecting people, it can really make an impact. I've said before in my own church that if I could connect all the people who've quietly come to me and talked about their mental illness, we'd have a thriving mental health ministry. And so sometimes we just need to think, how can I connect people? And fourth, stay in your lane. In other words, know your unique role within that person's support system. I remember a situation where we were trying to support someone as an organization, and the person's sister was involved. And the person's sister had a great heart. She had done a ton for her brother, but she was getting overwhelmed and the brother was getting annoyed. And what we realized is she was trying to be his case manager, his psychiatrist, his pastor, his therapist. And what she needed to just be was his sister. She needed to stay in her lane and say, there's something I'm doing as a sister that's really helpful to my brother. And now that I've connected to my brother to other supports, there can be people in each of those other lanes, but I just need to stay in my lane. And so maybe thinking about, with any person you're serving, what's the role you're in and how can you stay in that role and do what's most helpful about that role? Now, there's one obstacle to relational help that I want to kind of point out to you, just to be aware of, and that is armchair psychiatry. It's where you think that in order to help someone, to offer relational help, you need to know everything the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, says about that mental illness. You need to become a complete expert in all the bullet points that describe the mental illness. I want to argue that you don't need to reach that level of knowledge to be able to help someone relationally. And it's not because I think the DSM doesn't have wisdom in it. It's for three reasons. Number one, people are more alike than different. In other words, even if you have someone with bipolar and another person with schizophrenia, another person with depression, they all have in common that they're humans. And you can connect on the human side of things, even if you're not fully aware of all the ways in which their mental illness manifests itself. Second, there's a real danger of misdiagnosis. If you just assume from looking at them, oh, I know what they have, and you say, oh, they're schizoaffective. Oh, right. And you start doing everything that you think is appropriate to respond to someone who's schizoaffective, and yet that's not what their diagnosis is. You could be either, at best, being unhelpful, or at worst, damaging the person because you're so focused on responding to what you think the diagnosis is. And finally, as my colleague Mark puts it, a diagnosis is valuable if it helps me understand how to be with someone when I'm with them. I'll say that again. A diagnosis is valuable if it helps me understand how to be with someone when I'm with them. In other words, if this diagnosis helps you understand the person better so that you relate to them well, that's great. I remember a person I knew who had, at the time it was called Asperger's. Now they're just considered to be on the autism spectrum. And I learned about that diagnosis that people think and communicate in very concrete ways rather than abstract. And I went, wow, I really see this in my interaction with him. And I'm communicating in all these abstract ways. In that situation, knowing the diagnosis helped me know how to be with him. And if that's helping you and do that, for sure, take that into account. But don't think that you need to become a psychiatrist and understand all these issues in order to help a person relationally. And remember that you have, as someone who's representing a church, something that's hard to come by in many other places, which is concrete community. Concrete community is hard to come by. Our scriptures tell us this, and of the need for people to be in rhythms of maintaining community connection, something that many of the people who I discharged from my psych rehab program needed. Hebrews 10:25 says, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. We have a great opportunity to help people develop rhythms of relationship that they simply, in my experience, are not finding in many other places. And sometimes this is hard. I've had people who have said to me almost the same exact thing, living with depression. They have said, I don't want to go to church. I don't want to go to small group. I just want to stay home because when I'm depressed or I'm anxious, I isolate. But then they said, going to small group was the last thing I wanted to do, but the thing I needed most. And how many of us have experienced that when we didn't want to be around people, but once we did it and we got to the end of that experience, we realized it was needed. And so sometimes I'm having to encourage people living with mental illness to do the thing they least want, but they most need. And sometimes people just need an extra help, need some accountability to do that, which we don't push on them, but we at least offer to them. So again, we are now going to take some time for breakouts for 4 minutes, and we're going to discuss relationships. And these are the two questions I want you to consider together. First, what is a potential challenge for you of developing a supportive relationship with someone struggling with their mental health? Maybe you're going to think back to an experience you've had of this. What made that hard in navigating that relationship, developing it or maintaining it? And second, how does your role in their life impact how you relate to their wellness and recovery? This is that staying in your lane question. Depending on your relationship, what part and role can you play in their life? And what do you realize is a part that's valuable, but that maybe you can't play? So these are the two questions. Again, Ensign has put that in the chat. Any questions from you before we go out into our breakouts? Okay, Ensign, anything else before people head out?
Oh, we're going to be another 4 minutes, Dave?
Yeah, let's go ahead with another 4 minutes.
Okay, that'll take us to about, according to my clock, 52 after. So I'll try to keep you on track, and here we go. Okay, Dave, that was quick. We're all back. So back to
I apologize, everyone. I do recognize 4 minutes too quick. And so I want to make sure we get through the material. But perhaps if we keep on humming, then there might be chances to elongate the 4 minutes. I just don't want to get to the end and have you guys not get into some of what we want to discuss. But during the time we have together, just like last time, I want to see if maybe a couple people might want to share an idea, an insight, a theme of your discussion that could be helpful to the whole group. Anne, were you looking to speak?
Yes, I think in our group, two of us deal with family members who exhibit a lot of behaviors that are really, really hard to deal with, and we just get exhausted with it. And it is very difficult to stay in your own lane.
Yeah.
When staff and the person themselves want to keep putting you in different roles.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things we're going to get into later when it comes to offering sustainable help is how do we stay in it for the long term when some of these relationships can be pretty taxing to do that. And you're expressing some of what makes that hard. Yeah. Thanks, Anne.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to share from their own group? Renee, will you guys say something? You're on mute, Renee.
I did unmute it, but it went back. Sorry. I just wanted to say that their diagnosis isn't the person. So you need to be open to the person behind the diagnosis and to allow them to lead the conversation. If they have something they need to put out there, then just be open and not judgmental, but just be strong, be their umbrella when it's raining or whatever it is, because it's not about you. Sometimes it's about them. But like I said, not every conversation is going to be about that diagnosis. So they're a person. Just let that lead.
One of the things that you said in that, Renee, there's a lot of value. One of the things that struck me is the idea it's not about you. I know from my own experience, it can be very hard. There are times where it feels like it's about me. And I need to slow down and say, wait a minute, there's somewhere where I end and they begin. And sometimes it is more to do with, and we're going to get into this a little bit, I need to set a boundary or something's bothering me, but I shouldn't confuse that with actually what their journey is and what they need at this moment. And so it's not to devalue what we're going through, but it is to have clarity around what actually is the issue here and what belongs to them versus what belongs to me in helping the person.
I call that your humanness leaking.
That's good.
Your humanness is leaking out.
I'm not going to put that in my PowerPoint, but if I do, it'll say Renee right underneath it, just to make sure. Any other insights before we go to our third of our 5 approaches?
Well, I shared that I try to do 2 things. One is to ask open-ended questions designed to have them tell me about their life and challenges they're currently facing. And the second thing I do, and NAMI has taught me this, is to share that I do have a diagnosis And then once I have rapport, share what it is to live in recovery.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, there's a lot there. But I love the idea of the open-ended questions, because oftentimes it's so easy to offer closed-ended questions, to just yes and no, and it's not actually getting at giving the person a chance to tell us what they think we should know and tell us what's important to them. So I love that point, Steve. Okay. Thank you guys again for taking the time to talk together, and we'll see if we can again, we'll definitely have a couple more opportunities to be able to talk through things. But for now, I'm going to keep us moving. We're going to do the third of the 5 approaches. Then we're going to take that break that we mentioned before we go into the final 2. So I'm going to again share my screen. So we've talked about open dialogue. We've talked about relational support as well. And now we're going to talk about support that is holistic. I remember a time where I learned about the need for holistic support. It was very early in my career, and I was fired. I say that just to wake people up. I wasn't fired by my boss. I was fired by a woman I was serving for about a couple days. And basically, this person I was a young social worker, and she just cursed me up and down, told me she never wanted to see me again. And I just came back to my boss and saying, I don't know what's going on with this person. Like, trying to help her. Why is she treating me this way? And I said to him, is it just because of like the mental illness? Is it that she's bipolar and she's just having a really manic day? Is it just that she's harsh? We all have our own sins. Is it just she's really harsh with her words? Is it because of the trauma she experienced when her husband, not too long before that, left her and her kids for another woman? Is it the poverty she's going through because she's now raising these 2 kids as a single mother without a job? And my supervisor said, well, yeah. And what he meant was, I can't take any one of those things and act like that's the only part of her life that explains everything. It's only a spiritual issue. It's only a diagnostic issue. It's only a poverty issue. It's only a trauma issue. But all of those are part of this woman's journey. And if I'm going to support her, I need to pay attention to the whole person. So how do we do that? Well, we do it first by recognizing what we tend to focus on most. If all you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail. And I've known people who have the sin hammer or the diagnosis hammer or the poverty hammer. We all have our own hammers because it's our favorite cause to emphasize. But when we do that, it doesn't mean we're not placing our finger on something that's real. It means that we're potentially missing other parts of the person. So that's one thing we can do, is just recognize what's our hammer and what can we do to make sure we're becoming more holistic. And so as my own organization, Access Services, often puts it in our philosophy of care, we want to serve people's spiritual needs, social needs, emotional needs, and physical needs. And so each of our services, even if they're each tilted one way, always has to pay attention to each of these 4 areas. A concept that's really significant in the mental health field is integrated health. You may have heard of that before. It's the idea, and I just have a list of different areas here. It's the idea that sometimes how we're doing in one area of our health impacts another area. If we're struggling with our emotional health, that may impact our physical health, because if we're always in bed because we can't get up due to our emotional health, then we're not getting any exercise. Or our physical health may impact our mental health. and our spiritual health. Because if your physical health is keeping you, it is something that's keeping you from doing things you know are important. My mom struggles with chronic health problems. She is in bed a lot. She is unable to exercise like she wants to. She is unable to go to church like she used to. All these other areas of her health are impacted by her physical health. Therefore, we want to be holistic in whether we're at a church or whether we're at a social service organization, another ministry. All of these areas matter. To use another maybe basic example, if I'm not getting any sleep at night, I may be a bit ornery, right? In how I act. And if you're just to say, well, that's a sin issue, it's your orneriness, selfishness, you're missing out that I may be needing more sleep. That doesn't mean it's okay that I'm yelling at you. I shouldn't yell at you. But it also means that in addition to being challenged around yelling at you, it may be helpful to ask, what else is going on? What's happening that you're not being able to get the sleep you need? One of the tools you could consider in helping people holistically is what's called WRAP plans, Wellness and Recovery Action Plans. You see one link there that you could use, but you could just Google Wellness and Recovery Action Plan. It was a tool developed by Mary Ellen Copeland, and it helps you identify the different areas of health that could be helpful to a person. So you have, and I'll just quickly run through some of these, a wellness toolbox, which means what are the different practices you do in your life that bring about wellness? Your daily maintenance plan, which is what do you do in the morning? And it's maybe you or it may be someone you're helping. What does that person do in the morning? What do they do in the afternoon? What do they do in the evening to help them experience wellness throughout the day? What are the rhythms and the practices and the habits? You also list in this plan, what are the triggers, right? What are those things you need to be aware of that could make your mental health worse in a particular day? Early warning signs. There's a crisis plan. When you're in crisis, who are the people you should call? What are the coping practices you use? I know one person who has in their WRAP plan that they listen to worship music when they're in a really bad place and they call a friend during their crisis. Those are the two things in their crisis plan. Having this plan provides a framework of being able to pick up on all the different areas of holistic support for someone. And it doesn't mean you have to do things in this really complex way. It might be done on a napkin. I've seen that happen from crisis workers. It's just making sure you're paying attention to the different areas. I think Jesus provides a great example of this. This is a text I lean on when I preach about the church and mental health. Look what it says about Jesus and his ministry. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. He was paying attention to spiritual needs, the good news of the kingdom, and people's physical needs, healing every disease and sickness. It wasn't either or, it was both and. You see this in Paul too. He talks to Timothy, who's having some stomach problems. He says, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. I've shared this text before in youth groups, only to regret it instantly because they think I'm encouraging alcohol consumption. I'm not. What I'm trying to say is, Paul was aware of prayer, and I'm sure he was praying for Timothy and his physical health struggles. But he said to drink a little wine. Why? Because wine was understood to have medicinal value at that time. So he was encouraging holistic support. There was a man in my own church who I had asked once to come up and share during one of my sermons. I was preaching about scripture memorization as a spiritual discipline and the benefits of scripture memorization and meditation. And I knew Josh did that. What I didn't know is that Josh was going to use that moment as an opportunity to share about his own journey with clinical depression. And after he shared his journey, he told the congregation, there's two things that are helpful to me. He said, my wife will tell you this is correct. Medication and scripture memorization. He says, medication helps me get up in the morning, but it doesn't give me hope. For hope, I need God's word rolling around my mind throughout the day. For Josh, it wasn't an either or, it was a both and. And I'm not here telling you that every person has the same spiritual practices or that every person should take medication. Each situation is unique. But what I am saying is a both and response is often going to be much more helpful than an either or. So let's take, again, a few more minutes to discuss now holistic support. And I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give you guys 5 whole minutes to do this before we come back for discussion. And these are the 2 questions I want you to discuss. What connections have you seen between people's mental, physical, social, spiritual, and emotional health? You can take any 2 of those. Where have you seen that paying attention to one actually helps with another? Or where have you seen that a person struggle with one has caused them to struggle with another? And second, what dimensions of integrated health require more of your attention? In other words, what's your hammer so that everything's a nail? What do you need to diversify in being able to help people holistically? As usual, those 2 questions are there in the chat, and we're going to go ahead and take 5 minutes in our breakout groups.
Thanks, Dave. Everybody ready? Okay, here we go. Good. Everybody's coming back. And Dave, we're all here. It's that quick. So back to you.
Great. Okay. As usual, I mean, I can't imagine the insights you're going to have after 5 minutes of being able to discuss. That extra minute, I'm sure, is just going to be coming. So does anyone have an insight they'd like to offer from their discussion?
Steve, I see you talking again, but you're muted. So there you go.
Our group talked about journaling. They talked about being in nature. They talked about exercising. They talked about walking. They talked about a variety of things.
All wellness practices that might be able to be put in a wellness toolbox or a daily maintenance plan, it sounds like. Yeah, and all practices that each fall into different areas of holistic support.
And Kendra mentioned that just popped on also, got to thinking that a number in the group like to walk or being out in nature. And then Kendra noticed or reflected on inviting someone to go with you. So you're establishing a relational, it's establishing a relationship while you're walking, or someone enjoys doing that. I know I see that here in this apartment complex where I live. I don't like to work in dirt. It's work to me to have plants and flowers and all that kind of thing. But I see the ladies out there digging together and working together, something that they enjoy while their dogs are running in the dog park. It's just, they enjoy it, but it's an activity for them. And they're also establishing healthy relationships.
I like that. It's sort of a killing 2 birds with 1 stone of holistic support. You know, how can you combine practices to be able to help? I like that.
Yep.
Kendra, I think you were going to share as well.
One thing that I was noticing, we started talking about what our hammers were, but they really were like the different kinds of practices that help each of us. Like some of us, it was being in nature and spirituality. Others, it was the writing or the walking, physical kinds of exercise. But I guess where my brain was going with that is that we need to be careful about not necessarily forcing that on others, but maybe sharing more the feeling we get from it, so that that might help them begin to explore what kind of practices lead them to that outcome.
A very interesting point. It connects with something I actually was hearing earlier today. People were connecting. You may have heard of, the love languages that people talk about, and they were just saying how easy it is to seek to love people in the way that we typically most like to receive love, because we just assume that's what will be helpful to somebody else. And it just connects with your point, Kendra, of yeah, it may very well be that certain practices help us a lot, and that's great, and I'm sure they help others, but not letting that cloud our vision as to what actually might be helpful to the person in front of us. One last insight or theme from discussion that anyone might have before we take our break. The problem was I said break, and now there's nothing's coming after I said break, so that's my fault. I will say before we take our 5 minutes that I've made this PowerPoint available to Enton, and he's going to be able to send it out to you. So if there's anything where you thought I'd like to have those notes, they'll be coming your way, and so that we'll get that out to you as a PDF. Enton, anything else before we go on a break?
No, it sounds good. We'll keep the meeting open, so feel free just to stay muted. You can turn your cameras off if you want to. We'll go until just after 20 minutes after the hour. So we'll try to make it maybe 4-minute break because, Dave, I want you to have time to fit in those last two pieces.
Okay.
So get up, stretch, take care of some of the physicalness and bodiness and move, and come on back then. Okay, Dave, I think we've got most everybody back, and if not, it won't be long, 22 after, so you've got just a few more minutes to take us through what you want to do. Okay,
sounds good. We are going to go ahead now into the fourth area that we've been looking at, open dialogue. We've been saying is one characteristic of important help, and relational support, holistic support, and now sustainable support is what we want to be able to look at. Now, I want to touch on the need for this type of support. I have, over the years, hired several people at Access Services where I work, people with a lot of energy and enthusiasm. Sometimes young people. And I found myself saying to them, they're wanting to give 110%. And I found myself saying to them, I'd rather you actually give me 80% and stick around a little bit, because people give a lot of themselves to help people and get burnt out, and then they leave. And many people in our mental health system who are served there express frustration that there's a revolving door of mental health professionals, of case managers, because people get burnt out in the field. And it raises the question, not just for mental health professionals, but for any of us who are trying to support people with mental health struggles. How do we offer sustainable support over time? Burnout is one I've already talked about, but there's two other reasons this is so central. First, as they say, relapse is part of recovery. We shouldn't assume that we're just going to be able to help someone and the situation is going to be good forever. It's going to come back at times, some of the struggles that we're facing with people. And so they need people who can help over the long haul. As it's also said in the field, recovery isn't a linear process. We shouldn't imagine this kind of line from, one single direction, as if we're just going to do what we can to help and everything's going to go exactly as we expect. It's going to be more jagged and 2 steps up, 1 step back, or 1 step up, 2 steps back. And because of those realities, we need to be ready to offer sustainable help. Couple big ways, I think, of doing this. One is through self-care. I'm not saying selfish care. Some people of faith, Christians, can be, a little bit weary of this one because aren't we supposed to lay down our lives for others, offer sacrificial love? Yes, we should, but self-care is simply what we've all heard the adage of the pilot who puts on his own mask because before he'd put it on anybody else so that he can fly the plane. You need to make sure you're safe and you can breathe if you're going to be of any use to somebody else. So how are you, as a helper, paying attention to your own mental health, your own physical health, your own support system, or your other roles and responsibilities? I remember talking to a woman who was really struggling because so much of her life had become caring for her, tending to her husband's mental health, that she felt like she was being a worse mother, being a worse friend. She didn't have friends anymore. She wasn't able to serve in the church anymore. And so her other roles and responsibilities were falling away, and it was making her more and more frustrated with her husband. And what she realized she needed to do is make sure that if she was going to be of help to her husband over time, besides staying in her lane, which was something that she had to think about, she also had to think about, what are these other roles and responsibilities I need to tend to so that I can be the helper I want to be for my husband. In addition to being sustainable through self-care, we also want to be sustainable through boundaries. Number of different reflections on boundaries that I list here. First, set boundaries like we do in all relationships, which is to say, setting boundaries is not just something professionals do or pastors do. All of us have boundaries in our life. It just depends on where you're going to put them. For example, you all have people in your life. I have people in my life who, I would expect them to call me during a work day if they needed help. I have other people who I have less of a boundary around. There's people in my church, they could come and knock on my door at 11 p.m. at night, and I would say, okay, like, how are you doing? What's going on? But even people super close to me, like my brothers, if I woke up in the middle of the night and they were standing over my bed, I would say, dude, you passed a boundary. You crossed a boundary. That's not okay, right? All of us have boundaries, and it's okay to set them where we need to so that we can be sustainable with help over time. Now, when you set that boundary, it's worth preparing people for it. Talk about the boundary before you set it, oftentimes. I remember a man I was helping, living with a mental illness. I came every Tuesday at 9 to pick him up, to provide support. And every Tuesday, he didn't come down till 9:45 in the morning. I started to get frustrated by this over time. I said, you know what? I'm leaving at 9:15. So I left at 9:15. Well, he was frustrated at me. He was hurt. Now you might think, wait a minute, you're hurt. I stuck around till 9:15. But he said to me, but every week you stay till 9:45. The point isn't that he shouldn't have come down on time. The point is, I could have helped him a lot if I had set the boundary, because I was actually, with my behavior, telling him my boundaries didn't matter. I might say, hey, 9 o'clock, but my behavior said 9:45 is just fine. I needed to set that boundary verbally if I was going to be able to help him and not create confusion. Third, contain yourself by offering something. This helps those of us who struggle with saying the word no, because it means we're focusing on the yes. You may set a boundary. You may contain yourself. I can't do this. I can't, help you on these times. But you contain yourself by offering something. You say what you can do. My wife, who's also a social worker, was helping a woman out. And the woman she was helping wanted to talk to her every single night of the week when she was struggling with anxiety. My wife couldn't do that because of her other responsibilities in life. So what my wife said to her was, I can talk to you on Tuesday and Thursday nights for half an hour each night. The person didn't like that. But wait a minute, I need to talk to you this day and that day. She contained herself by offering something. She said, I can talk to you Tuesday, Thursday night. She focused on what she could do rather than focusing on what she couldn't do. She contained herself by focusing on by offering something. Fourth, define success according to what's in your control. Sometimes we define success by the outcome of that person who was not in our control. I remember a man who worked with the homeless, and he wanted to talk to me because he was getting burnt out. His definition of success was having everyone on his caseload housed every night. There's a problem with that. He can't control the decisions of homeless people, nor can he control the lack of affordable housing in our county. He was defining success by things that were not in his control, and sure enough, he burned out and left the field. When we can define success instead by saying, I'm going to show up when I said I was going to show up, I'm going to help people to the best of my abilities, and I'm going to connect people to any resources I'm aware of, just to name a few examples. Those are things in our control that it can allow us to sleep at night because we helped as much as we could, not defining it by something that's outside of our control. And finally, focus on the current stage of change. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with motivational interviewing as a concept, but motivational interviewing has within it the idea of stages of change. And I'm going to quick give you an example of what this looks like when I say stages of change. Imagine we're talking about weight loss. If I was wanting to lose weight, then I would say pre-contemplation is I'm not even thinking about it. I'm fine. I don't care about losing weight. Contemplation is I'm thinking about losing weight. Now, I'm not doing anything about it yet, but I'm kind of thinking about it. Maybe I should. Preparation is, okay, I'm beginning to look at Planet Fitness versus LA Fitness versus home gym costs. I'm preparing to lose weight. I'm looking at maybe Noom or different diet plans. Action is, I'm doing it. I'm changing. I've put in place these practices. I'm losing weight. Maintenance is, I've kept doing the things I wanted to do. Why am I telling you about the stages of change? Because sometimes we are in a stage of change. We're trying to help somebody in a stage of change that's different from theirs. If you are ever more invested in someone else's change than they are, you're probably at a different stage of change. I remember a time where I was helping someone try to get a job because they told me they wanted a job. And I kept bringing them job applications. I kept bringing them information about job opportunities. They kept not doing anything about it. I started getting really frustrated. One day, after I kept on trying to help him make a change, he broke down in tears. And he said to me, you keep on trying to get me to get a job, but I haven't worked in 21 years, and I'm terrified that if I work again, I'm going to get fired. What I realized was I was in the action stage of change, and he was still in contemplation. What he needed was not someone to come bring him applications and try to push him into a job. He needed someone to talk with him about the pros and cons of getting a job, to talk with him about his fears and insecurities about getting a job. I needed to meet him where he was at, according to his stage of change, versus force him to be in mine. These are all ways in which we can think about boundary setting in a way that ensures that we are able to continue offering sustainable help in a way that fits what other people need without overwhelming ourselves. Again, like with holistic support, I think Jesus gives us a great example. I think Jesus held together these concepts of being both intentional about self-care and boundaries, while at the same time being interruptible. This is what Mark 1:35 says. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up, that being Jesus, went out and made his way to a deserted place. And there he was praying. Simon and his companions searched for him, and when they found him, they said, "Everyone's looking for you." And he said to them, "Let's go on to the neighboring villages so that I may preach there too. This is why I have come." Jesus was intentional about self-care. He went to pray with the Father very early in the morning. And yet, when people found him and say, "Hey, I need your help," which we've probably all been there, he is able to respond. It's not about not being flexible to the needs of others. It's about being intentional about our self-care and boundaries so that we can offer sustainable support over time. So again, we're going to take some time for discussion. These are the two questions I want you to ask yourself, discuss together. First, what is a self-care practice you need to revisit or a boundary you need to reset? Maybe it's something you did before that you go, you know what, I need to get back into that. Or, you know, I used to set that boundary, now I don't anymore. It's making it harder to offer sustainable help. Second, what makes it difficult for you to establish boundaries when helping people? What makes that hard? Okay. Let's take time now to answer these two questions. Again, we can take 5 minutes for discussion, and then we'll come back into the larger group. Ensign, anything else before we send them on their way?
I think we're good unless we have any questions. And not seeing any, well, send you to your room. Give you 5 minutes.
Great.
Look at all these people coming back. So, Dave, we're all set, and it's back to you.
What was it like to have this deep voice appear to you through your into your groups? Was that encouraging and inspiring?
It was helpful.
I put him up to it because he told me he had the ability to do it. I said, you got to try that out. I haven't seen that yet. So he was kind enough to do that for me.
It was kind of like God speaking from the heavens.
That was the hope. Okay, so in my experience, of the 5 approaches, this is the one that causes the most conversation and the one that people tend to struggle with or to see themselves in. But you tell me, in your conversations, what were some of the themes? What were things that rose to the surface? Anyone feel comfortable sharing for their group? Remember the gift of going second. Joseph, were you going to say something?
Just got reconnected. I think for me, the setting boundaries with people I have love or deep friendship for, and they're in need, that can be real hard to do.
Yeah, I've talked to people who are trying to apply this with family members, and they have said that the closer the relationship, even if they know cognitively it's valuable and necessary, it's very hard. And I've seen some people only be able to do it in some ways if they believe that doing so is what's needed for the person they love, because they want to stick on it in the long haul. But that's easier to say than do. So I appreciate you being honest about that, Joseph. Thank you.
Brenda
Anyone
was
else?
trying to catch in, so I'll put Brenda on it.
Great. Anyone else want to share what their conversation was like?
Yeah, go ahead, Brenda.
We were actually struggling with the same thing, the boundaries. And then I'm a childhood trauma survivor and lived in a lot of dysfunction, and noted that some people really don't even know what boundaries are. They've never been able to establish them because boundaries were something that were trampled all the time. And so you can lose yourself in it and not even know, because you're not used to not giving everything that you have every moment, because that's what it took to survive.
That's a great insight. Yeah, that this is not either for the people setting the boundary or for the people for whom you're trying to set a boundary with. This may be very hard for them given their history, or the fact that this may not be intuitive for them or something they're used to. Yeah, I think this is all. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brenda.
It just feels like rejection.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking, as you mentioned that, Dave, that one way of me understanding it would be, where do I really set a hard boundary quickly? And it might be like, well, how about when a telemarketer calls wanting me to buy something? And I know some people who try to be polite with them, and I'm not rude, but I'm going to say no and hang up. And that's a real quick boundary, like a knee-jerk reaction.
Yes. And, there's all sorts of boundaries. Sometimes it's just going to be a behavioral boundary. And when you're setting it, I like the example you gave, Joseph, because you don't always have to spend a long time defending it. Alan Keith Lucas, the social worker, said, you don't need to defend something you're not willing to change. If you're not planning on changing it, then, you don't need to spend tons of time debating it. It's just, this is what I can do for you. And whether a person likes that or not, it's just the fact of this, that's what you're going to be able to do this time.
I find another thing as chaplain I need to do. A lot of the people I aren't necessarily involved in churches to change their peer group. If you're in a peer group that encourages you to use and abuse drugs and alcohol, you need to find a group of people who have a different set of values, a different lifestyle. And so changing peer groups is necessary.
So that's a good point, Steve, around the notion of it's not just helping people isn't just how we set boundaries to help them over time. It may also be equipping them or even modeling for them what boundary setting looks like, because it may not be something they've practiced very much. Any final comments before we jump into our fifth and final approach to helping?
I think another part of it is how we feel when someone sets a boundary with us.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the things I brought up was sometimes you should be allowed to be the helpee and not the helper. And to it's even good for them to have the opportunity to help. So sometimes if you need to flip the tables so that they have that as an option as well.
It's interesting. My mentor at Access, I remember years ago, he would have us go through the experience of thinking about what it's been like in our own lives to receive help, and what types of helpers were beneficial, what type of helpers were hurtful, and it put us in the mindset of being helped and receiving help, and it helped us better understand what it looked like to give help. I mentioned Alan Keith Lucas a little bit ago. There's a great classic book he wrote called Giving and Taking Help, in which he addresses some of these issues. So people might ever want to consider that. It's sort of a classic in the field. Well, we're going to jump in. We have 11 minutes left. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk us through this final area. We're going to talk about it as a larger group and then close out. Thanks for all the good conversations you've been having in your breakouts. I appreciate it. Okay. Finally, we've looked at open help, open dialogue, relational help and support. Talk about holistic support. We talk about sustainable support. Finally, collaborative support. I have had people, clergy, people from churches, call me up. I remember this one occasion where a person called me up at 11 o'clock at night. Said, Pastor, I'd connected a person we serve to. And he said, Dave, this is above my pay grade. And there had been a man we had connected him to, whose wife called the pastor and said he's locked himself in his bathroom and is saying he wants to kill himself. And so the pastor called me saying, hey, it's above my pay grade. I can use some help. I don't know that it was above his pay grade. I think that he had a lot of experiences that made this pastor really qualified to help. But it's an example of the value of knowing there are people you can reach out to, conversation partners you can have to help you help others. I want to touch on a couple scriptures that undergird this idea before I get to some other practical principles. One is just this reality that no ministry leader has all the gifts. This is an area we're working through as a congregation. 1 Corinthians 12 and 13, just this notion that for the body to function, we need all hands on deck. All of us have different gifts, right? And so even if people in your congregation think you are the wizard of ministry, or people in your organization think you have it all together, you and I both know there are certain gifts you bring and certain gifts you don't bring. And knowing who those people are you can reach out to for support, that you can collaborate with, is going to be really significant for your ministry. Ecclesiastes talks about this as well, that it's just the facts that two are better than one. You know, when you can have more people involved in responding to somebody, to go back to our fourth approach, it takes the burden off of you, right? It allows you to have some time for self-care while also allowing all the gifts of Christ Church to be able to come together in helping someone. Now, one of the challenges can be summed up in there was a gathering where I was moderating a discussion between a number of mental health professionals and some clergy in our county. And one of the pastors at the end of this meeting, we were talking through things, he said, I didn't even know you guys existed. Like, there's like 40 mental health professionals. He just didn't know who these organizations were. And it struck me that you have mental health professionals and clergy who basically don't know about each other and yet are both trying to serve their community. In fact, one of the drug and alcohol providers afterwards said, I'd never been part of a conversation like this before. Like, he was never talking to clergy or to faith communities in the county about these things. We need to build these relationships. But a problem is, had multiple pastors tell me, I don't make referrals because I don't know who I can trust. Because they're concerned, and sometimes understandably so, that if they refer a person from their congregation to a mental health provider, that the mental health provider won't take their faith seriously. And if they don't take their faith seriously, or even look down on their faith, which I've seen some providers do, that they're causing more harm than help. So that's a challenge. At the same time, if you have a conversation partner, if you have people you can identify that you can trust in your community because you've gotten to know people, it can really help when the need comes up to know whether you should refer or not. Should I refer? Is the situation that's in front of me enough for me to go at it alone? Should I get other people involved? A few different things to consider. One is what I've just been talking about. I'm going to go clockwise from the top left. Who is a conversation partner I can call to think it through? Who's that person I can call and say, hey, this is above my pay grade, right? If you're going to do that, you're going to have to begin getting connected in certain collaborative spaces I'll mention in a minute in order to identify that partner. However, it might be someone in your own congregation that's a mental health professional that you can lean on. Second, sorry, my body's getting in the way here. Does this person's behavior keep them from normal daily living activities? Getting out of bed, working, leaving a house, or what they call in the field a functional impairment. If it is, you should reach out to a mental health professional. Are we open to exploring medication? If so, they're going to need to talk to at least a personal care physician, their family doctor, or to a psychiatrist. Is trauma or abuse present? If it is, likely having people who have a lot of experience in that area, who specialize as therapists or counselors in that area, is going to be really valuable. These are just a few things to be thinking about when you're wondering if you should refer someone. But as I said a moment ago, some of this starts earlier in the process where you're building relationships so that they're there when you need them. So you could participate in community collaboratives. There are collaboratives in your local community, like probably so, where there will be faith leaders and local governments and providers coming together for the common good. In our own county, we have a multi-faith coalition. We have various other collaboratives. What's in your community that you can join? Second, partner with organizations to develop trust. Find out about organizations in your community that share your values. Put trusted resources in your phone. I'll mention that in a moment. Do you have like a number you can call for the local mobile crisis hotline to where it's just in your phone? When a crisis comes, every county should have a mobile crisis team or some way that the county's mental health system has provided for crisis response. In our own community, we've put together, and you might consider doing something like this in your community, a care portal where we connect. It's an Intersect Community Needs Facebook page where we connect the needs that are identified in the social services world with faith communities, and they're all a part of this care portal and can dialogue with each other for the sake of collaboration. These are the numbers in our own county that are the mobile crisis numbers in Montgomery and Bucks. Again, what are the numbers in your county that you can reach out to? There's a ton of resources here. I'm not going to name them all. It's mainly just showing all the different types: mobile crisis, mobile psych rehab, transition aged youth. Steve mentioned NAMI, inpatient hospitalizations, faith-based counselors. These are all the types of resources. Not every county has as many as others, but do you know the resources in your county so that you're not doing this all by yourself? And now what I want to do is just finish up our time together, talking about a couple things. First, are there resources you found most helpful or resources you'd like to know more about? I just want to open that up, hear from you, and then I'm going to have one more slide to show you. So I'm going to keep it in this vision right here just because I want to show you one more slide as I close. But in 1 minute, yeah, to give examples of resources you found helpful to supporting people with mental health struggles in your own community.
I've found as a teacher that the whatever the local educational service agency was a good place to start. If it was for help outside of the school setting, they oftentimes knew people in the community who would serve just the general population.
That's good. Great example, Anne. Any other examples?
I have found that even though I'm retired, maintaining some level of relation with prior colleagues who are still active in the field of mental health or holistic health, so that I can call people who are still connected and then through them get a gateway to others for referral.
Great idea. Great idea. And, you know, sometimes those resources can be in places we haven't thought to look. When I've spoken at different churches, I've had several mental health professionals come up to me within congregations and say, you know, I'm excited about playing a role for my church in this area because I wasn't sure how to connect my day-to-day world in the mental health field with my church. But maybe I can be a resource for my congregation when needs like this come up. So each of you may have different resources both in your community and in your congregation. Here's some information that's on the slide. And I just want to finish off showing you a head here, which seems strange. But I'm showing you a head of a colleague of mine, Glenn Milstein, who works at City of College in New York. And he does research on the ways in which faith communities can collaborate with social service organizations. And his big insight that I want to pass on to you is that when churches do what churches already do, they're simply helpful and valuable for people with a lived experience of mental illness. In other words, even if you didn't learn anything more about mental illness, just by being the church, by being God's people, by offering community and love and belonging to people, you're making a huge impact. So I just want to encourage you as we close. I hope this information can be helpful that we've provided, but I hope you know that by the ministry you're already providing, you are helping prevent mental health crises, and you're helping people who've gone through them. So thank you for your passion for the work and your time that you've spent with us tonight. Enton, is there anything we need to say to close out?
Well, Dave, what we should say is a big thank you. This has been a packed couple of hours, and I'm looking forward to your follow-up as well in a week. So everyone come back in a week, invite others to quickly register and join us. But Dave, you've also said you're willing to stick around for a few more minutes to be able, if people want to ask a few more questions before you go, but we'll conclude things and then hang around if you want to chat for a moment. But Dave, I want to give you the last word. And so invite you to bring us to a close together.
I think there's a lot of people who are in our congregations who are wondering, is this a place where I can talk about this experience? And I'm still learning. People in my congregation where I've been serving there for 15 years as a pastor, 20 years, I'm still learning people's experiences. So I would encourage you to continue being curious about the lives of your people, because there may be things they're just not sure they're ready to share yet. But if they do, I've seen many find their churches to be one of the most significant, if not the most significant source of wellness and recovery in their life in terms of what God's using. So that's one thing I just want to encourage us to be curious with the people whom we're already walking with, that God has placed us alongside.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Friends, that concludes our course for tonight. If you want to stick around for a little bit and chat, feel free, but please feel free to go and come back in a week, and we'll pick up and forge even more forward ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone.